How does an immortal being deal with death? Welcome to the Immortal Gifts Podcast, where Dave Robison, Veronica Giguerre, and J Daniel Sawyer read my novel, Immortal Gifts, to you. I'm Catherine Filliard, and I wrote this. This episode of the Immortal Gifts Podcast is sponsored by me. If you like the podcast, tell your friends. If you've run out of friends to tell, buy the book. It's available in ebook, paperback, hardcover, large print, and audio. I also have a Patreon and a Ko-fi, if that's your thing. Impatient? The audiobook is available at my shop and my Patreon and will be headed to all the places audiobooks are sold. And with that, on to the show.
Where I Began. Ludwig, Berlin, Prussia, October 31st, 1762. My new rooms were adequate, if plain. I lived over a bakery, so it was always warm in the winter and smelled divine. Sadly, I couldn't eat their products. I patronized a local butcher — I love the early sunsets of the darker months of the year — saying that the blood was for my cook to make blood sausage. It occurred to me that perhaps I could eat blood sausage myself, but this wasn't the case. I tried it both raw and cooked, both with unpleasant consequences. It both lessened my thirst and made me vomit up the parts that weren't blood, concentrated into small balls like owl pellets. Revolting. What had Thomas done to me? All my plans for my life gone. All the people I knew would grow old and die without me. Would I ever see my parents or brother again? I suppose that the only bright spot was that my hair was safe, though it no longer grew. I collected rings, but they only had so many fingers on which to wear them. I supposed I needn't dress humbly any more either. I indulged my vanity, thinking that if this was my worst sin, I was doing quite well under the circumstances. I invested in and collected art. It turned out I had a knack for it, even if it was distressingly like trade. I prospered, and Thomas eventually came around to visit, discuss theology, and occasionally borrow money. He also taught me the ins and outs of being a vampire, although he laughed at me when I asked if there were any books on the subject. He impressed upon me at length the importance of only giving the gift of eternal life to the best and most worthy individuals. This was flattering, but he didn't have my devotion to the arts. Imagine, I said, if one were a painter or a composer or a performer with centuries available for practice. Thomas merely smiled, indulgent. I fear that's your passion, not mine. But keep an eye out for those you consider worthy. I didn't like Thomas, but I felt like he knew things I needed to know. Sometimes we would fall into our old patterns of him being a teacher and authority. I wasn't sure how to change that.
Abraham, Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, February 27th, 2019. We fell into a routine where I would feed Ivan things like cow's blood or raw bloody chicken livers liquefied in the cat's blender for every meal. Inanna sniffed his dish a few times, appeared confused, and went back to her own. The scent of iron. By the way, it was almost 2 months since Victoria had died. I still cried every time I saw a picture of her. I didn't want to forget, but remembering hurt so much. "I'm sorry," Destiny said one morning as Ivan lapped up his blood enthusiastically. "But that's yucktastic." She winced and poked at her scrambled eggs, her lip curled. I tried not to find this comical. I'd replaced the lace tablecloth with one with a floral pattern. She was wearing the cozy blue bathrobe and bunny slippers again. Well, I suppose the bathrobe was warm. The house could be a little on the drafty side with the high ceilings and aging windows. I was wearing the same jeans and t-shirt I'd worn the day before and thought I should change, on principle. I smirked at her. We all have our dietary restrictions, it seems. She snorted out an almost laugh. So, what made you want to be a vampire? She'd asked me this before, and I'd given her a glib answer with a hand wave. Destiny was my wife now and deserved a proper answer. I sat down at the table next to her, and Ivan finished his breakfast and climbed up into my lap. It wasn't my choice. She glanced up at me surprised, fork suspended in midair. Her head tilted, making her long red braid visible between head and shoulder. A car that needed muffler work drove past the house. Destiny took a sip of coffee, ate another bite of eggs. What happened? What do you know about kashrut? I asked, looking up at her. I'm not sure I know what that is. Kosher. Oh, Destiny bit her lip. No bacon double cheeseburgers? I laughed at that and reached over to squeeze her hand again. Good start. How detailed do you want me to get? She shrugged. As much as you want to tell me, but at least enough for me to understand the point you're trying to make. I looked her in the eye. Blood is not kosher. The process of kashering meat starts with it coming from a kosher animal and being killed in a kosher way. But you have to remove all blood from the meat by rinsing and soaking in water, then salting, then rinsing several times. Also, if an egg contains blood, you're not allowed to eat it. You don't just crack an egg into a bowl of ingredients. You crack it into a different container first so you can check it for blood. No blood. Not even fish blood, which isn't considered actual blood, so it's not technically treif. But you don't want to give the appearance that you're consuming blood. I bit my lip and petted Ivan some more. This was a bit, as the modern Americans say, heavy, but I remembered Destiny's question and smiled. Also, no bacon double cheeseburgers. Or cheeseburgers. Okay, she said, sounding thoughtful. I hugged Ivan, who was looking back and forth between us, almost as if he could understand the conversation. I considered going to a rabbi and asking if it was covered under pikuach nefesh, but I was too afraid he'd say no. What? Pikuach nefesh. The principle that preserving human life overrides any other commandment. I was afraid that he'd say that no, I was no longer human, and that if I really wanted to uphold pikuach nefesh, the least I could do is never feed off a human. I avoided biting the innocent for what it was worth. If I got a little snack in the course of self-defense, however, I was probably being dramatic. It's allowed to eat non-kosher food if it's necessary to sustain life or cure an illness. But blood is extremely taboo, I sighed. And then there's blood libel. I'm sorry, Destiny smiled, looking sheepish. I don't know what that is either. I loved her innocence. It almost felt wrong to explain, but I did. People believed Jews made Passover matzos with the blood of Christian children. It was used to justify violence, often around Easter, since Easter and Passover are so close together. One year they burned my neighbor's house to the ground. I could hear them screaming. My brother Samuel played with their son. That's stupid, Destiny said. How could people believe anything so dumb? People believe an astonishing array of dumb things. I scowled at the table, then petted Ivan again when he glanced up at me. I didn't want to upset Ivan, but it felt like every anti-Semitic stereotype was either a role they forced us into — money-lending had been considered usury until recently and a sin for Christians — or the exact opposite of the truth. See above. You don't talk about this very much, she said. She sounded surprised. No, I don't. I was conflicted. For what are obvious reasons. I couldn't walk to synagogue in the daylight. Short distances only, like from the house to the car in an emergency, and then only if I completely covered my skin with SPF-rated fabric and if I didn't stay out too long. I wore gloves, a scarf, an enormous hat, sunglasses. I looked like a cross between a beekeeper and the Invisible Man, and sometimes told people I suffered from porphyria, if they asked. With those items, I couldn't stroll around the block, but I could drive. Without, I needed to run indoors at vampiric speed. In other words, I couldn't participate in religious services anymore. And even if I could walk to synagogue, Kohanim are forbidden to have contact with a corpse in Leviticus 21:1. So would my presence force them to pray somewhere I wasn't? Do I need to explain what a Kohen is? A Kohen is a descendant of the sons of Aaron who still have specific honors and restrictions, including blessing the congregation at some services. They wouldn't know unless I told them, but I would know. I haven't davened, prayed, shacharit or mincha, the morning and afternoon prayers, with a minyan of 10 Jews in over a century, because I would burst into flames walking into the synagogue on Shabbat. It felt like another life ago. I suppose it was. I could have joined a reform or conservative congregation, which allows driving on Shabbat, but I was old. The reform movement started during my lifetime. Before the reform movement, people were just plain Jewish. I didn't identify with any of the modern movements. And frankly, I could accept reformed liturgy, but drew the line at organ music. Also, I would need to park very close to the building, and suspected that if I called a rabbi and asked for his halakhic position on vampires joining, I might find myself having an awkward conversation with a mental health professional. Also, there was the matter that the dead are released from all obligations, including keeping kosher. Was I dead? Animal blood is treif. Not fish blood, but fish blood is disgusting, and also doesn't quench my thirst. I tried, and it's also not very tasty. But it was better than attracting the attention of modern law enforcement. Bullets hurt, and you had to fake your death, assume a new identity, move. No, best to avoid the whole thing. I'd managed some actual human blood with a forged doctor's prescription to treat a blood disorder. I supposed I did have a blood disorder of sorts, and claimed I had a private nurse to administer it. I had an in with a sympathetic blood bank employee, as blood is only good for transfusion for 3 to 6 weeks, but I could still drink it after that. I told the blood bank employee it was for my dissertation research. I also felt like anyone who physically assaulted me was fair game. For a small snack, nothing too serious. But people were so law-abiding these days. Placing myself in harm's way felt like entrapment. That said, the United States was absolutely the best place for a vampire to live. All castle doctrine this, and stand your ground that, and self-defense. But again, best not to attract the wrong sort of attention. Shoot an attacker with a gun? Yes. But bite him with your fangs? Ugh. Too much explaining to do. I scratched Ivan's ears, and he gazed up at me with bright, sweet, attentive bronze eyes, and purred. "So, you understand," Destiny said. I glanced up. "My vegetarian thing." Destiny's vegetarianism isn't religious, but it was an adjustment, I admitted. I spent a lot of time under bridges, starving, subsisting on rats, only drinking people who attacked me. I wouldn't wish that on my wife, but it wouldn't be like that for her if she became a vampire. She would have me. "You can admit it without undermining your case," Destiny said, smiling. I smiled back. "All right. Yes, I understand. It was an adjustment for me too, but I still don't want you to die." "I know, sweetie," she said. "The cycle of birth and death is holy in Wicca, but it also sucks balls." I laughed. I couldn't help myself. "At least the death part does. And you can't have birth without death. You have to have death to make room for new births." She tilted her head. "If it's true that vampires are infertile, is that why the world isn't overrun with them? Well, it was true that vampires were only created one way, and that way wasn't birth. But we're not indestructible, and I don't consider vampire overpopulation to be an argument against turning. In fact, Flora told me most of us don't make it past 200. There are arguments for turning sooner rather than later that I won't use because they're, as the expression goes, hitting below the belt. My previous girlfriend broke up with me after a date where I swore spectacularly when the waiter spilled my drink on me, and he answered, "Dude, don't talk like that in front of your mom." We'd been together for 20 years. I still remember the way her face went into a slow fall. I don't want Destiny to even imagine how that would feel. No. These days, if I like it, I put a ring on it, as the modern Americans say. In fact, the idea of Destiny dying of old age made me want to go sunbathing. But that's not a fair argument, and I refuse to use it. I try to be an ethical person despite my condition. "So," Destiny said, "tell me about it. How were you turned?" Abraham, Berlin, Prussia, February 10th, 1841. As the last lingering sweet note from my violin echoed through the dark room, my patron clapped. Baron von Dunn dressed in an ostentatious, old-fashioned style and refused to go out during the day, citing the need to keep his complexion pale. He wore expensive rings on all of his fingers, including his thumbs. His golden hair was pulled back into a soldier's queue and tied with a ribbon. His apartment over a bakery was well appointed, if not to the latest style, and he lived alone. Aside from a servant, of course, despite the occasional efforts by matrons on behalf of giggling young women who found him attractive. Sometimes I thought, from the way he looked at me, that those young women had the wrong idea entirely, but it wasn't my place to judge, especially because I was a liar. The academy wouldn't accept Jewish students. I'd stammered out the lie that I was a convert when I stumbled over my new name. My teacher had been standing right next to us, and I felt guilty about this, and also had no idea how the Baron would react if he learned the truth. I'd probably imagined those looks anyway. I knew that I had classmates who were rumored to be romantically involved, but we'd never actually discussed the matter. In other words, what did I know? I still remember the scarlet cheeks of the older man I was studying with at the yeshiva. "Young Avraham, you are both very innocent and quite the radical." Oh, sure, the passage in Leviticus is usually translated as, "You shall not lie with a man as you do with a woman. It is an abomination." But the original Hebrew is ambiguous, in my opinion. Loosely, "not underage male woman's lying down." I believe it's a reference to our ancient Greek neighbors. He wasn't the wealthiest or most sought-after patron in Berlin. In fact, many thought him very odd indeed. But he liked my playing, and I didn't mind if he was odd as long as he paid. To be honest, I was too sick to play, but I needed the money. This night he had a friend over, a tall, balding man with a fringe of frizzy dark hair whom the Baron introduced simply as Thomas. Thomas watched me gravely, with something in the position of his eyebrows and the wideness of his eyes implying I'd unwillingly impressed him. My hair, unfashionably long, flopped over my face. But my father had died. You're not allowed to cut your hair during the Shloshim, the 30 days after the funeral, which I'd missed, of course, because of travel. I received word that my father would die and rushed home. I'd arrived on the last day of the Shiva, the 7 days after the burial where you wear torn clothes and weep, and your friends come by to feed and comfort you, and say the mourner's Kaddish with you. I stayed for the Shloshim with my mother and my brother Samuel before returning to Berlin. Berlin felt cold and unwelcoming after visiting home. I loved Berlin. The hustle, the music, but it's hard to pretend to be someone you're not. And mortality reminds you of who you are.
That was lovely, Baron von Dunn said. You are very gifted.
He had the faintest hint of Bavaria in his vowels. I wondered how long he'd lived in Berlin, and if he tried to moderate his accent like I had. Of course, I was a native Yiddish speaker, which is a bit more fraught than Bavarian. I bowed.
I'm glad I pleased you, Baron.
He stepped forward and pressed a bag of coins into my palm, which I pocketed without counting, and I thanked him again.
Don't you think he's gifted, Thomas?
He plays beautifully, Thomas said, sounding reluctant. But you know that, unlike you, music isn't my passion. His voice was soft, quiet. The rooms were over a bakery, so it was warm and everything smelled of bread and cake. Despite being rented rooms, they were still luxurious, with dark paneled wood walls and rich red carpets and sofas and heavy draperies, and a glittering chandelier. Thomas stood in the shadows as if he didn't want to be noticed. I coughed, filling my handkerchief with blood. My hand was full of wet, red cloth. I kept enough self-control to put my violin in its case rather than dropping it. My chest ached and I was tired and dizzy. When I looked up, the Baron was watching me, blue eyes glittering.
Are you well, Abraham?
I was most definitely not well. On the way back from Vreshen, I had caught consumption. I mumbled something about how I would be fine and straightened up, and had another coughing fit. A bit of blood escaped the handkerchief and dripped down my wrist. I thought I might faint and placed my clean hand on a table to steady myself. The Baron watched the blood drip down my arm and land on the thick, red Persian carpet with an expression I couldn't parse. He licked his lips, swallowed, with his eyes locked on my bloody hand. Was he angry?
Forgive me, I said.
He lunged at me, almost faster than my eyes could make out. Or was that my dizziness? Either way, quicker than I could react. I had a strange, hallucinatory vision of long, pointed teeth rushing at me, followed by a sharp pain in my neck and the press of his body against mine as he held me up. The room spun, darkened, and I reached up to cling to him in a desperate attempt to stay on my feet. I was cold, and the room was getting darker and darker. My last impression was of a lock of blonde hair brushing my cheek. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor with blood in my mouth. Had I coughed up more blood, bitten my tongue? And Baron von Dunn was kneeling beside me. I was tired, disoriented, and thirsty. Colors appeared more vivid, noises louder, and the room brighter. But I thought that was from passing out. The room spun, majestic, slowed, stopped. I found myself staring at a gold and crystal chandelier, about 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, crystals glittering in the gold and rainbow candlelight. I'd never seen anything so lovely. How had I not noticed it before? Thomas stepped out of the shadows and eyed me, one eyebrow raised. Had I fainted? Why was I lying on the floor? How embarrassing! I moved to sit up, but I was still dizzy.
I'm afraid you're going to need to forgive me, Abraham, the Baron said. I couldn't bear the thought of the world losing your talent.
What? Clearly the most brilliant thing I could have said. I rubbed my face with my hand, the one that wasn't bloody, and glanced around. The room was still colorful, bright. Baron von Dunn's clothing had a subtle pattern in it I hadn't noticed. I could hear voices outside, almost well enough to make out the words. I'd never fainted before. Perhaps imagining that I had heightened senses was a result.
Well, he said, it was presumptuous of me, but I've cured your consumption.
I sat up and felt my neck, which was smooth and dry. Had I imagined him attacking me?
I don't understand. Of course you don't, the Baron said and smiled.
Had his teeth always been so sharp-looking? Had I never seen him in so bright a room?
It's all right, my dear boy. You know how, through transubstantiation, wine becomes the literal blood of our Lord Jesus?
I nodded, though as a nice Jewish boy I didn't believe a word of it. He smiled.
The cost of the cure is that you need to drink more literal blood.
This was a cure I wasn't aware of, but of course I'd thought there was no cure.
How much blood do I have to drink?
The Baron laughed at me.
I've made you a vampire, you silly boy.
Like the Polidori novel? Was this a joke? I stood up to leave, but staggered to the rich blood-red couch instead. I was so thirsty, thirstier than at hour 25 of the Yom Kippur fast.
Can you have someone bring me a glass of water?
Thomas made a sort of irritated grunt and rolled his eyes. The Baron laughed again, but he rang the bell. A frightened-looking maid came in, a young woman with frizzy blonde hair, and he said,
Greta, offer your wrist to Abraham.
What? The maid walked over, timid and thin and sad, and rolled up her sleeve. Pale bruises covered her wrists with a single set of puncture wounds near her hand. I could see the pulse point in her wrist under the faint light green and lavender bruising. She held out her wrist to me and watched me, her eyes expectant. She smelled like fresh-baked bread, or perhaps that was the bakery downstairs.
I don't understand,
I repeated.
You're being obtuse,
the Baron said.
With respect, Baron, I said, I don't understand this joke, and I think that I should go.
I tried to stand, but I was so tired and so thirsty.
You don't believe in vampires, he said.
I don't, I answered. They were a Christian cultural concept, mostly familiar to me from my Christian neighbors or from literature translated from English. Our custom was to sit with a body, never leaving it unattended until it's safe in the ground, and to put them in the ground as soon as possible. We would know if one got back up and walked around. Okay, there was the Alaka, but I was clearly not one. They're described in the Sefer HaSadim as a living human being that drinks blood and can shapeshift into a wolf. Also, they're usually female, and not undead, whatever that is.
I would pick a rationalist,
he muttered, and moved with inhuman speed to stand next to Greta and bite her wrist. He offered it to me. I recoiled in disgust. Baron von Dunn grabbed her bloody wrist in one hand and held my shoulder down with the other, and shoved the wrist at my mouth. I fought. Blood is not kosher, and human blood, revolting. But some of it got in my mouth, and to my horror it was as delicious as Shabbat dinner. I thought of home, of my mother's fish with raisin sauce, followed by soup, followed by a meat course, all with wine and challah bread. Would I ever be able to share Shabbat with my family again?
It's all right, he said. It's just like taking communion. Feel your teeth, boy.
I put my fingers in my mouth, and yes, my teeth were longer and pointier than they'd been. I stared at him. Thomas stepped closer, and the maid recoiled visibly at the sight of him.
Go on, boy,
the Baron said.
It's all right. I pay her well for this. Just like communion.
I drank a little, because I was so thirsty, but I cried a little too. I didn't want to harm the girl, and it also appalled me to be drinking something so unbelievably treif. I was 19 and had never broken kashrut before, not even as a poor student. I always had an excuse where I claimed I had food at home or would only eat a whole fruit or vegetable.
It's all right, silly boy, the Baron said. See, she's fine, and so are you. Blood is a constant presence in our faith, not only in communion, but also in our art. The more pious, the more bloody, it seems. It's what binds us together as Christians. The Eucharist and Christ's blood is our connection to our neighbors, our fellow parishioners, and all of humanity. Please tell me you're not a reformer. I'm a Jew, I blurted out. We don't drink blood.
The Baron drew back. Thomas hissed and crossed himself. Even Greta appeared shocked, the shock driving the sadness from her eyes.
You told me you converted, the Baron said, his voice wary.
Thomas glared at him. I don't think he noticed. His eyes were locked on me.
I lied, I admitted. I just wanted to attend the academy.
I knew it was a mistake as soon as I said it, but it was a relief to not lie anymore.
I'm going to ask you to leave and never return, Baron von Dunn said, his voice quiet. Still, I'm glad that the world didn't lose your gift with the violin.
Yes, there was no point in explaining anything. I was sad, but also felt a lot less guilty about my lie. Clearly, the truth had been a mistake. I stood.
Thank you for your past patronage.
I nodded to Greta.
Thank you for...
I picked up my violin and headed towards the door.
You're just going to let him leave?
Thomas asked. His eyes glittered malevolently, but his voice stayed almost serene, which somehow was more threatening than shouting would have been. The Baron closed his eyes for a moment, exhaled slowly, and said,
Yes.
Then he stared at me with eyes that were both sad and worried, and that frightened me even more. Thomas growled, and I gathered up my things and left quickly. I didn't know what the alternative was to their letting me leave, and I didn't want to know. As I descended the stairs, I heard Thomas say,
The gift of eternal life is only for those who believe. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die.
The Baron responded,
That's a spiritual reference, not a reference to our kind.
As I passed out the door and beyond the point where I could hear them, which was much farther than it had been before. When I got back to my lodging, I counted the money the Baron had given me. A gold mark, 3 silver thalers, and a handful of groschen. Enough to go home and ask Rabbi Mendel what to do about this conundrum. On the other hand, one should never ask a rabbi a question if one doesn't want to hear the answer. The rabbi is there to offer his scholarly opinion, not tell you what you want to hear. Did I want to go to the rabbi who trained me for my bar mitzvah and tell him I'd become some kind of monster and wanted his halakhic opinion on the most observant way to be a monster? Yes, but also no, because I thought I wouldn't like the answer. The answer being, of course, that drinking blood is wrong, if possibly covered under pikuach nefesh, and drinking human blood is worse than wrong, and that drinking human blood until someone dies is murder. Perhaps I could merely ask him if I was an alaka, but I didn't want the answer to that question either. I wondered if I could turn into a wolf. I closed my eyes and concentrated, but if I had that ability, I had no idea how to use it. I was exhausted, so I slept. Abraham, Berlin, Prussia, February 11th, 1841. Sleeping was a mistake. I woke up ravenous, and when I peered out the curtain, I burned my fingers on the drapes. I couldn't leave my boarding house, and I was hyper-aware of the other tenants. I had a loaf of bread on my dresser, so I tore off pieces and devoured them, and promptly vomited them back up. violently enough that I felt motivated to not try again. I knew the cellar had rats, so I went downstairs. It had previously been cold and dark and damp, but I no longer felt the chill like I used to, and saw better in the dark. Was I dead? I didn't want to be dead. There were indeed rats, and there was also a quiet peeping noise in a remote corner. I grabbed and drank a rat. I couldn't bring myself to say the blessing for a meal over rat blood. Still starving, I went to investigate the soft sounds in the corner. A brown, striped tabby cat was nursing 3 very tiny kittens. She hissed as I approached, but I offered her the rat remains. She accepted the gift, gnawing hungrily at the carcass. Her kittens were so slight and helpless, little blind fluffy things. The landlady, a sallow, sour-faced older woman with graying hair, came downstairs.
What are you doing? I was looking for some charcoal to draw with, I lied. Oh, no, you didn't. Again?
I thought she was talking to me, but she headed towards the cat. The cat hissed and drew itself up, hackles raised.
What are you doing? I asked. I can't believe she had kittens again, the landlady said. She's here to eat rats, not to populate the cellar with cats. I'll have to drown them. What?
Judaism forbids cruelty towards animals. We're allowed to eat meat, but kosher slaughter is intended to be humane. We're not supposed to take eggs while the hen is sitting on them. And if you ask 20 Jews to explain the prohibition against mixing milk and meat, 17 will say, because the Torah says so. One will say it was a pagan ritual. One will explain that it's insensitive to mix symbols of life and death so cavalierly. And one will suggest that you should think about how the poor mother goat would feel to know that not only had you killed her baby to eat it, but that you were cooking it in the milk she produced to feed it. Drown kittens.
Drown them. I've drowned dozens of them. What, do rich music students' families not drown unwanted kittens?
She curled her lip at me and reached towards the nest of kittens. The mother cat snarled and slapped her hand away with her claws. Rich, red blood bloomed under the scratch marks, smelling deliciously of iron. She swore.
I'll be leaving this evening, and I'm taking the cat and her kittens with me,
I said with as much dignity as I could, even though the smell of her blood was making me salivate. She laughed at me.
Such a ridiculous soft thing you are. Take the cat if she'll let you. Good riddance. But you're paid through the end of the week, and I won't be giving a refund.
She reached a hand towards the nest.
Let me drown just one as payment for the scratch.
I grabbed her hand and glared at her face, very aware of the delicious smell of her and the blood dripping onto the floor. My stomach growled. We stared at each other for a moment, and her expression changed, eyes wide with the whites showing around the edges, pale cheeks. I didn't want to hurt her, and hated frightening her, but I wouldn't let her hurt the kittens.
You leave now, she said. I'll leave tonight. Let go of my hand. I'll call the authorities and have you removed.
I'm not proud of it. But it was the desperate hunger and the threat of the authorities, along with the smell of blood, that did it. I bit her. I didn't kill her, but I left her lying unconscious and bleeding on the cold floor, and suspected death would come for her soon enough. I hid her behind some boxes. I needed to leave, to hide. If I was arrested, well, Jews had only been citizens since 1812. I walked over and kneeled in front of the mother cat.
Trust me?
I reached out slowly and stroked her head. I think she understood that I defended her and her babies because she let me pick them and her up and put them all in an old crate. I draped a blanket over it and took them upstairs. I packed rapidly, watching the light under the window fade, and after sunset I headed out with everything I owned. We moved into a dark place under a bridge. I named the cat Rebecca, and I hunted for her and her babies until they were old enough for her to teach them to catch their own food. A hilarious process involving Rebecca doing little pantomime ballets with dead or mostly dead rats and mice for her kittens. I named her children Jacob, Rachel, and Reuben. I slept in a pile of crates during the day and kept blankets for Rebecca and her kittens. It was a far cry from my life in Vreshen. Despite what the landlady had said, I wasn't rich. I had a small inheritance from my grandfather that wouldn't last long. Part of me thought that life under a bridge was what a monster deserved. I thought about my mother and my brother Samuel often, thinking of evenings at home by the fire, comfortable chairs, delicious food, and unconditional love. Well, I supposed I had unconditional love from Rebecca and her kittens, but I longed for human companionship. I was desperately hungry, but I was never tempted to drink my only friends. I drank from rats and from bandits far from my bridge, and longed for home. But what if I lost control like I had with the landlady and bit a relative? I wanted the company of humans, but felt as if, as a monster, I didn't deserve it. One night, a man followed me under the bridge, slow and stealthy. I thought he was a thief, although something felt familiar about him. I was going to attack him, but as he stepped closer, I realized he was wearing ostentatious old-fashioned clothes under his cloak and was extremely pale. Rings glittered on all 10 fingers. Baron von Dunn and I stared at each other for a moment, awkward. He burst out laughing.
Ha ha! Abraham! I can't drink you, can I?
No, I said, I suppose you can't. I was smiling, though. I was having so many emotions, including anger that he'd done this to me and abandoned me. But I was so lonely that I was also relieved to see a familiar face. And it was funny.
Ah, Abraham, he said, you have no idea how hard this has been for me. No one has your talent with the violin. No one.
Oh, yes. It had been hard for him.
I even broke ties with Thomas over it. He thought we should kill you, but destroying your gift would be the greatest sin imaginable in my eyes. God gifted you for a reason.
Lovely. I supposed I should be grateful that he thought I should live, but I was having trouble feeling gratitude here under my bridge. Besides, I didn't know who Thomas was besides the Baron's friend.
And then poor Greta died unexpectedly.
Had she really died unexpectedly? I suppose he didn't seem the sort to waste his favorite food source. He shook his head.
Play for me one last time, like you used to. Please, Abraham.
I was so desperate for human companionship, even his, that I pulled out my violin and played. The most difficult pieces were simple, natural, although the violin felt brittle under my fingers. I put the sorrow of being separated from my people, the death of my father, my longing to go home, into the music. Even Rebecca and her kittens couldn't resist, and sat at my feet and chanted. Baron von Dunn wept, tears flowing down his face, silent sobs shaking his body. The last note faded away. Baron von Dunn stood transfixed, still weeping. Then he blinked as if waking up from a nap.
Scheherazade, he breathed, you could tempt me to stay here until dawn.
Why would I want to do that? He laughed and pulled out his coin pouch. Instead of removing money, he removed all his rings and his pocket watch and put them into the purse and handed it to me.
Don't live under a bridge. You're destined for greater than this.
I took the money and said nothing. He stared at me, tears drying on his face. Things were awkward again. He adjusted his collar.
Take care.
I bowed with a flourish that might have had a sarcastic edge. When I straightened up, he smiled at me, tipped his hat, and left. When I thought he was out of earshot, I muttered, "Ein dik auf a zickerstrickel wirst du hoben at Zissentoit." Hang yourself from a sugar rope, and you'll have a sweet death. I opened the coin purse. It was full of marks and thalers. The rings were even more valuable. I invested the lot in my brother's bank's New Berlin branch. Abraham, Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, June 11th, 2019. Over breakfast, Destiny was eating eggs and toast this morning from the Ren Fair dishes as it was getting to be Ren Fair season, while Inanna ate her kitty health food and Ivan ate a dish of pureed chicken liver. Inanna glanced up from her dish and gave Ivan a long, appraising look. I tensed, ready to stand. Abraham? Destiny was wearing an oversized T-shirt advertising the Indigo Girls this morning. Inanna swaggered towards Ivan. "No," I said. "Inanna, no." Inanna looked at me in the eye with an irritated expression and butted Ivan away from his dish, maintaining eye contact with me. Of course she did. Of course. If only cats understood rude gestures. It was probably inevitable, based on their previous relationship, and I suppose we were fortunate that it had taken 4 months for her to try it. Fortunately, Ivan was such a sweet boy that it seemed unlikely that he would do anything about it. I stood. There was a tense moment while Ivan watched Inanna eat his breakfast, and then, with preternatural speed, he slapped her with his claws out. Inanna sailed across the room at high speed, leaving a bloody spray behind her and hitting the blue stove with a wet thud and the scent of iron. Blood pooled on the black and white checkered floor and sprayed up toward the ceiling. Destiny screamed and rushed to her cat, grabbing a dish towel to press into the wound. Ivan appeared confused and distressed. He stared down at his bloody paw, then at me. "I can fix it," I said. "I think you've done enough," Destiny sobbed. She picked up Inanna, still applying pressure to the wound, and glanced around. "Carrier! Oh, gods, it hit the jugular." He didn't realize his own strength. I stepped closer. "I can fix it." "I'm sorry," Destiny said, holding Inanna in a towel and pressing the wound. "Ivan is a monster." I felt a moment of hurt, protective rage, but she continued. "He might violate dangerous dog ordinances. If the county knew—" In a flash, I was standing between Ivan and Destiny. Behind me, Ivan meowed plaintively. "I'm a monster," I reminded her. "A scary monster who used to lurk under bridges and creep out at night to hunt criminals and vermin in the dark. Was that really what she thought of me? Her husband? Abraham?" She was uncertain now, her voice rising as if in a question, as if she understood the insult she'd given. Some of my anger bled away at her uncertainty, leaving exasperation. "Let me help." She laid Inanna on the table, moaning. "This is a mistake. This is a mistake." I don't know whether she wanted to atone for her faux pas, or if it was a moment of weakness because she didn't want her cat to die, but time was of the essence. I bit my wrist and used the feeding syringe to drip my blood into her mouth. I could have bitten her, but I thought she'd had already bled enough for it to take. The transformation is more likely if there is an injury or ill health involved. This was a calmer transformation, as these things went. She shuddered rather than thrashed. Well, there was no blood clot to dissolve. Where Ivan took about a half hour, she took about 10 minutes. She stood and gazed up at me and glanced at Ivan, and then sat and started washing her bloody fur energetically while her wounds closed. "It's a mistake," Destiny said. "If the county finds out, they might try to put them down. That would be a bad idea. They can't just give them an overdose of anesthesia," I said. "They'd sleep it off. The only way would be to cut off their heads." Destiny stared at me in shock.
And I remind you, I added, my voice sounding uncharacteristically cold even to my ears, that Ivan is my cat, and I will not allow that. God help animal control if they try to take my cat. My wife has never seen me kill, but if anyone tries to harm Ivan, I'd have to change my name and move, of course, to avoid Thomas. But I'd risk that for Ivan. I love Ivan too, she stared down at Inanna. And I love Inanna, but this is a mistake. She's a bitch, Abraham. The sweetest cat in the world, but she won't do what she's told and attacks landlords and delivery people. And you gave her super strength and a taste for blood. Well, I said, on the upside, since they now eat the same thing, she might have a newfound respect for Ivan. At least I don't expect cat fights. Oh, gods, Destiny said. Yeah, don't break those up, I said. Leave them to me. I stared down at Inanna, who gazed back at me with a shocking deficit of sass in her bronze eyes. From now on, I told her, you do as I tell you, young lady. From Destiny's expression, she was thinking something like it was a good thing that cats don't speak English. What she didn't know, and what I didn't tell her because I didn't think it would further my cause of turning her, is that I have some sway over my fledglings. I don't know the exact depths because my maker never explained it, and I'm not an asshole, but it's enough. Inanna attacking people from this point on would no longer be cute, and I wouldn't allow it, so it would only happen if I weren't at home. I loved Inanna, but if I were to choose my forever companion, it would have been Victoria. Victoria and Ivan. It had been 5 months and 9 days since she died. And true to what I told Destiny, I had gotten to where some days I was fine, and then it would hit me out of the blue that my sweet, precious girl was gone. That she had died in my arms when I was too stupid to notice, that no amount of money could bring her back. Ivan started lapping Inanna's blood off the floor.
Destiny. Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. June 11th, 2019. I'd put my foot in it this time. I carried Inanna into the bedroom and shut the door. She wriggled loose and glanced around the room, curious, like she didn't understand why we were in there. It was clear from his expression, the compressed lips, the flash of hurt in his eyes, that Abraham considered my calling Ivan a monster the same thing as calling him a monster. I don't think of Abraham as a monster. He's a person with human reason who understands his condition. Ivan is a cat. A cat. He's adorable, but he hurt my sweet girl Inanna because he's an animal and doesn't understand his situation. And my apology for calling Abraham a monster was to let him do the same thing to my darling Inanna as well. Turn her into whatever Ivan was. By the way, Inanna was a precious angel baby with me. She hadn't warmed up to Abraham yet, but lots of cats are one-person cats, and I thought Inanna was one of them. She's such a sweetheart that when my landlord said she'd lunged at him, I assumed he had a cat phobia. But multiple people had said the same thing. When I was at home, she calmly watched the repair people or whatever. She was a darling at the vet. My cat was only aggressive if I wasn't there to tell her it was okay. I needed to commit. I mean, I was committed to Abraham. We were married, but I needed to fully commit to having a vampire husband. Like, he wasn't an unusually soulful goth with a medical condition. He was a vampire. He was an immortal being who'd come to terms with his state, more or less. A vampire who seemed to hate being a vampire in some ways and consider it a nifty cure for disease in others, rather than seeing it as a disease. If Abraham didn't see it as a disability, neither should I. I lay down on the bed, on top of the white comforter, and Inanna curled up on my chest and purred like nothing had happened. I kissed her on her soft head and told her she was a good girl. even though she'd left bloody paw prints on the bed. If Inanna was going to outlive me now, I hoped she planned to warm up to Abraham, eventually. I even envied her eternal life with him for a moment. Unfortunately, the cost was still more than I wanted to pay.
You've been listening to the Immortal Gifts Podcast, and I'm your host and author, Catherine Villiard. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happened next, and please rate the podcast to help other people find it. See you next time, and remember, becoming a vampire is a thing that can just happen to you, but being a monster is a choice.